Good day, everyone. This is Christina Como with the GSPC project team, and in a moment I'll be introducing Stephanie Price. Just before we get going, I just wanted to remind everybody the webinar protocol. So automatically the software has muted the microphone or the transmit on the telephone handset that you might be using. So the best way to express a need to ask a question today would be to write your question into the question box attached to the little control area that you have for the GoToMeeting software. If you do press the raise hand button, we'll see that, and if we have the opportunity to open the mic and take verbal questions, we will. However, in order to respect the 1 hour time frame, we may find that it takes most of our time just to review the content and make sure that everyone has had a chance to see this version of the content and the explanations that we're able to offer today. So we'll get through the content as expeditiously as we can and have as much time for questions or comments at the appropriate time as we proceed. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Price, who will start off the webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is an important milestone for the project. We are at the end of our first round of consultations. And at the beginning of this, I told all of you that I was excited because I thought we were about to embark on the most interesting conversation I'd ever had at Engineers Canada. And here we are at the end of it already. And it was the most interesting conversation I've ever had at Engineers Canada. I want to thank everyone who took part in this. This was a collective effort, and everywhere we went, we got better. From the very first consultation to the very last, from the very biggest regulator to the very smallest, we got meaningful and useful and unique input from every single place we visited. And that is just amazing to me, and we're really lucky to have that. What we're going to do today is go over the high-level findings and talk about the next steps. And what we have accomplished over these 2 months is something that I think we should all be really proud of. I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of the people who've been out on the road supporting this and are going to keep supporting it as we take all this information and turn it into something useful and meaningful for all of us. So I'm going to turn things back over to Christina and let her go through the first few slides, and we'll go back and forth between the two of us as the webinar progresses.
So just quickly to review, the material that we're going to be presenting today is directly tied to the structure of the material that we covered with all of the regulators during each of the conversations. So we'll be talking about the feedback we received on the guiding principles. Originally, there were 6 guiding principles, the 12 purposes associated for Engineers Canada, as well as kind of general comments about the preamble, and the purpose of the Board of Engineers Canada, and the 10 potential purposes that we discussed with you during the consultation. We also talked about a category of things which in these slides that follow we've simply called board structure. So when I talk about board structure in the future, it means what were the response to all of the things you have on the slide here. So the mandate of directors, including their roles, responsibilities, who are they accountable to as they move forward, term limits for directors, accountability to the board, which was we referred to as CEO, the chair of the AB, and the chair of the QB, the role of the CEO group, role of the president's group, and the participation at board meetings of the deans and CFES. We also had to discuss board size, and Stephanie will be discussing that slide in particular. Did you want to add anything on this now? We're good?
We'll discuss it later.
Okay, so essentially what we had in front of us was the resolution that was passed by the annual meeting of members in May of 2017, and some options with a kind of an open discussion around the options. And so today you'll also see across the country how each of the regulators chose to select one of those options, or maybe even look at kind of a hybrid of one of the options as well. So again, what we'll be presenting is the views captured on one slide of each of the 12 regulators. Obviously, we can only give you a cross-section of what we were able to document during the 3 hours, and sometimes a little more than 3 hours with each of the regulators. And I think the big thing will be to kind of see how, which are the points where there's a lot of consensus, which are the points where there's some different points of view that might be useful to keep the discussion going. We're not here to resolve or try to further the feedback at this point. We simply don't have enough time on this webinar. But what we do want to do is make sure you have a chance in a fairly condensed period to just kind of do that run through and see in your own minds how all of this information might fit together. And of course, this information, along with the additional notes that we've been able to produce as a result of the consultation, that's the information that's going to the governance committee so that they can look at what the next steps are, how to consolidate this information, update purposes of the board, purposes of Engineers Canada, take actions on structure, etc. So again, just raw data that we have at the moment that will eventually go to the governance committee for refinement and next steps. And with that, I'll go back over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Christina. So one thing that I want to make sure all of you know is that you did receive a copy of this presentation just a short while before we started. So if you're having any trouble following things, if there are any technical difficulties, you should have a copy, and also you have a copy to refer to afterwards. So if we go through something too quickly, don't worry, you have a chance to look at it in more detail later. So I'm going to start off with these general findings and interpretations. I think of these as the lessons learned from the first round of consultations. There is one thing that was very clear, and everywhere we went, it was reinforced and reiterated that there is no doubt why Engineers Canada exists. Engineers Canada exists to serve the regulators. Everyone agrees on that point, and it has been very strongly stated and very clearly heard that Engineers Canada should act only in accordance with the intentions of the regulators. Another thing that we heard repeatedly in most places was that to varying degrees, regulators have lost trust in Engineers Canada's ability to understand and act on the needs of the regulators. And because this is a long-standing problem, the need for a solution is urgent. We need to take action and address these problems. There is still some limited appetite for Engineers Canada to do work that is in the national interest. But that is only true if the national interest is defined as the collective interest in all regulators and is defined with all regulators. There was, of course, as we discussed this, acknowledgement then that defining the national interest is the responsibility of the regulators, and implementing viable solutions is also something in which regulators share responsibility. So turning to the consultations themselves and how the process went, everywhere we went, we did hear that the face-to-face process was valuable and that it was the best way to have the kind of detailed discussion that's necessary at this point for us to all understand the issues and for you to provide the detailed input that we need to move forward. Many people also expressed that it was a great learning opportunity to be part of the consultation. We did our best to answer all the questions that came up, to provide all of the information that was requested within those 3 and 3.5 hours, and to follow up where we couldn't provide that information. So a lot of people learned some details that they weren't aware of before, and that was a valuable part of the process. Another thing that we learned was really helpful was that providing the written materials and the report beforehand was really helpful. Almost everywhere we went, someone pulled out a dog-eared copy of that had their notes all over it. And I have to tell you, it was kind of exciting to see that every time, to know that people had taken the time to prepare and use those documents and cared about it that much. The other part that was very helpful was to open up the ability for people to provide feedback afterwards and to circulate back these slides so that you had the opportunity to correct us when we had misinterpreted things, or if you had additional things to add after the consultation had closed. So those are things we're definitely going to keep doing. Although it felt like a lot of time was given to this at the outset, 3 to 3.5 hours per consultation, it was in fact a challenge to get through all of that material in time. And all of you will be aware that we're asking for much more time in the spring consultations with strategic planning, and we're quite certain we're going to need every minute of that time, and we'll do our best to respect your time and to get through everything that we have to get through. So as we went on, all of these foundational governance documents were improved by your input. And the next step, at a very high level, the most basic thing that has to happen is that the governance committee has to take all of this input and finalize recommendations for the full board. And the board will consider those recommendations at the February workshop, and then the board will develop final recommendations based on all of that. we talked everywhere we went about the board structure and the board size, and there is certainly support for making changes to the board size. And you'll see more about that towards the end of the presentation, what specific feedback we got. Some pieces where we still need to do some work and we don't have recommendations yet are around clearly stating the mandate of directors and how that is going to be expressed within the terms of reference, and also clearly stating the role of the presidents and finding a role that makes the best use of their expertise and time within the governance structure of Engineers Canada. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Christina, and she'll be able to take you through slide by slide the input that we heard at every regulator and every stop along our whistle-stop tour of Canada.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm basically going to go across the country west to east and then make another sweep by to talk about the north. And as Stephanie said, we'll have one slide for each regulator. So here we're talking about engineers and geoscientists, British Columbia, but let me just take a minute to orient you to the structure of the slides so that basically you'll see that same structure replicated each time. I won't emphasize it, but when we were able to obtain a direct quote from something that we thought was kind of representative of the discussion, not a wholly synthesized part of the discussion, you may see a quote that came from something somebody said during the process. We'll talk about the input we received on the guiding principles, the purpose of Engineers Canada, the purpose of the Board of Engineers Canada, and board structure. We'll synthesize board size at the end, and I'll just let you review, other than by exception, basically what happened as a result of the consultation process. So in BC overall, in terms of guiding principles, and I won't cover every single point on every slide, but I'll try to highlight the ones that kind of begin to tell the national story, and you'll have ample opportunity to review the slides because you all have copies. So a key thing that BC wanted to see in the guiding principles was the interest of the national body must take preference over individual viewpoints, and even though those viewpoints are strongly expressed. So the importance that there is a national viewpoint was something that BC felt, and we heard different kinds of ways of expressing that, as you'll see going forward. In terms of the purpose of Engineers Canada, the purpose number 3, which related to diversity, we got a lot of comments related to that particular purpose on diversity, but in BC in particular, they said it should really be going forward, the strategic direction and eventually the operational imperatives on that should all be focused on removing barriers as opposed to trying to track quotas. On purpose number 4 dealt with accreditation, and you will see we heard a variety of viewpoints on the issue of should accreditation address only undergraduate programs or both undergraduate programs and either graduate or graduate and other types of programs. But in BC, they felt that the accreditation process should be focused on undergraduate programs only. In terms of the purpose of Engineers Canada itself, you'll see here, and it'll be repeated a few times, there's quite a large consensus that the key purpose of the board was to provide strategic direction and to make sure they manage the CEO, and a few other points here expressed in BC. In terms of board structure, BC highlighted the need to have more research and additional analytical information that would explore the options associated with board structure and the merits of those options. So perhaps going beyond the options that were presented during these consultations. And although we did not set out to look for this information specifically, as you will quickly see, we heard it from many of the regulators, is the issue of the relationship with CEAB and CEQB. And in BC, they felt that these should be operational committees reporting to the CEO. Next, I'll talk about Alberta and the things that we learned there. So, and you'll see in the cases where the regulator has not had an opportunity to reconfirm or to make sure that they have approved the content. We've made the content you're seeing today. We made sure that we've annotated that on the slide. So in some cases, we're still standing by for either further updates if that's needed for the regulator to be fully comfortable with the information that we have here. So an interesting thing that happened in Alberta was something they called the Prime Directive, which was in the guiding principles. It was the key focal point that they thought would really help to clarify a lot of things. And that's where they said that Engineers Canada should hold paramount that all Engineers Canada actions are in direct service of the engineering regulators and just have absolutely no ambiguity on that point. They also discussed that directors should represent their regulators in their actions with Engineers Canada. And this came up during guiding principles. It came up during purposes for Engineers Canada. And it also came up during the discussions on the mandate of directors. Do directors directly represent their regulators, or are they independent entities, or are they needing to act within a hybrid of that relationship? So this was Alberta's point of view. We also received quite a bit of content from Alberta. In fact, they actually provided additional content and documentation after the event, which we now have on record. But during the event in particular, they mentioned that the focus of the need to for Engineers Canada, the action that they should have in relation to the regulators should be something that is in service as opposed to in support, which is the way it was drafted in the documentation. And this brings important clarification to how that role would be moved forward. They also felt that nothing was needed in terms of promoting to the public at the international level, therefore limiting that particular purpose, which originally said national and international, I believe. In Alberta, they also agreed that the accreditation process should be focused on the undergraduate programs, but they also made comment that the role of the CEQB, they also commented that the role of the CEQB is to provide standards, and therefore their role should be mostly guided by providing services for the assessment of engineering qualifications on behalf of the regulators. And sometimes when we were discussing the work of the QB, it was sometimes said that the QB does standards and everything else that is not handled by the AB. And so that generated the kinds of discussions and comments that you may see from various of the regulators. There was often a discussion on affinity programs, and we understand that there's actually a separate action that's moving forward on affinity programs. But in Alberta, it was very clear that there must be greater transparency in the administration of the affinity programs under purpose number 8. Under purpose number 9, we heard it expressed in different places and in different ways, but the need for a collaborative platform for all regulators to work on national issues, and that this would be, in fact, an important function of Engineers Canada to enable that type of exchange of information between the regulators. Also, just right down here at the bottom under add, we had a number of regulators who said that Engineers Canada should have a purpose to facilitate coordination between regulators, officials groups, etc., to play that role of acting as a hub that enabled cross-regulator functionality on things that made sense and which were identified as being useful by the regulators. The overall theme that came up over and crystal clear was what Engineers Canada does needs to be directed by the regulators through the board into the strategic plan. And there was little room for autonomy in that, is that Engineers Canada acts in service of the regulators. In terms of the purpose of the board, we actually have some really detailed notes from Alberta, but they kind of summarized it as really the board exists to manage the CEO and to provide strategic direction from their point of view. In terms of the board structure, here again, there was a clear view that directors need to vote representing the interests of the regulators. And also another point that when we talked about, you'll see a little bit later that they had chosen a board size option of one director per regulator. And in that context, they said it would make a lot of sense for the CEOs to actually be the director who represented the regulator, because they're the ones who understand most clearly how Engineers Canada can support the regulators. We're going to be very transparent, is that in Alberta, they were not satisfied with the consultation process. So we're taking that very seriously, and we believe there are some strong lessons learned from that experience. And we are definitely going to be making changes to the consultation process to make sure that we've addressed Alberta's concerns in that regard. Now, we actually went to Saskatchewan first of all of the regulators. They volunteered to be part of the first two pilots, in which we wanted to make sure that we had the gist of the structure of the consultation process in hand. And so it was very helpful to be able to have an early open discussion with them where they allowed us to do some fine-tuning. In terms of the guiding principles, Saskatchewan stated quite clearly that the concern for fiduciary responsibility for the fiduciary responsibility to Engineers Canada and not to the regulator may cause a conflict, particularly if an Engineers Canada director also sits on their local board. So this was an expression of how do we resolve if there is any duality between a director's responsibility, Engineers Canada as a whole, and the responsibility to the regulator. And this is how they expressed it in Saskatchewan. We often had some discussion around how the presidents are able to exercise their role within the governance process. And we heard a lot of areas and have documented a lot of areas where that can be improved on. And in Saskatchewan and in other places, we heard that a more available, transparent record of all decisions that was available for the presidents to review would really go a long ways to improving that situation. Under purposes of Engineers Canada, we heard in Saskatchewan and in a number of other places that the terminology which we asked you to comment on did not specifically mention the need to protect the public, and so we've noted that. Again, when it talked about promotion being done by Engineers Canada, that was okay at the national level, but not, and just kind of a reminder, I think it was always clear, but we were reminded that that kind of activity does not occur at the provincial level because that is wholly and only the jurisdiction of the regulators themselves. Saskatchewan was pretty comfortable with the 9 purposes of the board. We had some general discussions. Of course, we always got amplifying notes. But in terms of board structure, we did have a good discussion again about the President's Group and whether or not the President's Group in its current format and the kinds of meetings that currently occur in conjunction with board meetings, and is that the best option moving forward? And again, in Saskatchewan, as we did in most places, there was the feeling that there's definitely some room for improvement in terms of how we provide the best possible value to the President's Group. When do they meet? How do they meet? What do they do? What opportunities they have for information exchange, etc. In Manitoba, Manitoba expressed a strong sense that they basically trusted Engineers Canada to move forward with the agenda. They did make a comment that there should not be an option or the need to pull back on a decision because of how much money a particular regulator may have contributed to the process as a whole. So they had some clear views that they made their contribution and they were happy with satisfied that how the process moved forward from there. In terms of the guiding principles, there was good discussion, as there often was, on the diversity and the need for where it should fit. And we saw in a number of places that actually diversity or equity and diversity or diversity and inclusion should actually be reflected as a guiding principle and even perhaps in addition to where it currently appeared in Purpose number 3 for Engineers Canada. So that came up in Manitoba as well. And once again, the issue of how can a director be double-minded, i.e. how can a director represent the regulator and then vote in the best interests of Engineers Canada as a whole. And I guess the extension to that is even if that were not in the interests of the of the regulator. So this is definitely a topic that there is some difference between regulators and the current practice, let's put it that way. And that came up just about everywhere that we went. In terms of board structure in particular, again, we heard comments about CEAB and CEQB being a staff function. As we said earlier, we sometimes heard about them being an operational committee. We're aware that this discussion occurred a few years ago. However, the regulators seem to still have it in mind as something that is perhaps not yet resolved. For others to decide. In Manitoba, they are also very comfortable in terms of board structure that reducing the number of advisors on the board would be just fine. And as you may recall, our recommendation was that only a representative of the CEO group become the only advisor to the board, and that other relationships be established with the deans and with CFES. In Ontario, we had a very interesting discussion, and the discussion was very broad. We kind of got into a lot of the contextual aspects of some of the things that we'll be putting forward. And once again, in Ontario, although we discussed the guiding principles and got useful notes about them, one of the key questions that PEO had was, how in fact will these principles be implemented? And again, you'll see that others express that same thing. So we can't just claim that these are the principles. There also has to be some way of following through on them. At PEO, they were concerned that the role of the CEAB and the CEQB should be clarified because the word board in their title is rather confusing. Again, they provide us amplifying complements, and they did support all of the recommendations for board structure. They had some really strong points about board size, but we will be covering those in a few minutes. At OIQ, again, we met with a regulator who had very strongly held views. We had, as we did almost everywhere, a really strong turnout of folks who were there. So we heard from multiple people, as was common, hearing multiple people and their point of view on everything that we contributed. And again, we received amplifying information from OIQ after the consultations in writing, and so we were able to really enrich the feedback that we had. In terms of the purpose principle number 1 on how Engineers Canada serves the regulators, OIQ is very clear that engineers' role is to facilitate the exchange of best practices and respond to the collective needs without creating an obligation for any regulator. Again, the concept of serving the regulator, I think, came across really clearly. In terms of promotion in Quebec, they felt a real important aspect of that, or a role for Engineers Canada, was to develop international agreements like the Washington Accord, perhaps in preference to other types of activities. Under Principle 5, once again, concern that the mandate and accountability of the CAQB and AB should be restricted and controlled by the board. In terms of the discussion we had about what kinds of things Engineers Canada should be developing, again, the point of view is that whatever is being developed, either tools, excuse me one moment, that any tools or guidelines that are being developed must respond to a requirement that has been identified by the regulator. So regulators, across the board want positive control on the activities that Engineers Canada is engaging in. Once again, they felt there was a need to look at and have an agreement on affinity programs. And under principle number 9, which had to do with kind of tracking changes in the profession and regulatory component, it was emphasized to us a few times that it's not just that Engineers Canada needs to do it, but it must inform the regulators of any changes or advances that it discovers in the process, and that must be an integral part of what happens overall. And Quebec had the unique contribution as well that the national synopsis of legal decisions and how those decisions impact the profession would also be very useful to do in terms of looking at best practices. Under purposes of the Board of Engineers Canada, again, we heard that it is the regulators who must approve all Engineers Canada projects with roles and responsibilities defined by the board or by the regulators themselves. In terms of changes in the board structure at OIQ, they felt strongly that supplementary analysis was required before we move forward, and that in fact maybe we are moving too fast, that this should happen in phases. It should begin with a vision for Engineers Canada, defining the roles of the directors, and then moving forward at a more balanced pace, or just taking more time to get this done. And the need to start from that pre-analysis viewpoint was very strongly held in Quebec. They also expressed the view, once again, that a director is not independent and must act solely in the interest of their regulator. So again, one of the key things that we received from Quebec is that we need more work on analysis and evidence supporting any decisions before we move forward. New Brunswick, again, was one of the early adopters, one of the pilot consultations that we did. So they were number 2 in the process, and once again helped us refine the process for the benefit of all the other regulators as we move forward. So again, a very open discussion occurred in Fredericton. And we were able to kind of explore not only the content, but also some of the structure of things. And early on, we heard that comment of, in terms of guiding principles, how will these principles be implemented? So don't just state them, but have a way of following through on them. And we acknowledge that in principle number 5 was not expressed so much as a how. It was expressed more as a what, and when we really wanted guiding principles to talk about the how component. And we'll probably see some changes to guiding principles as a result to that clarification of the approach. When we looked at purposes of Engineers Canada, again, a discussion on diversity. And in New Brunswick, they felt that the term should include equity and diversity in terms of both components. We got some clarification about the need for the role for accreditation. And we heard this expressed in different ways in different jurisdictions, but here the caution that Engineers Canada is not a regulator and must not cross that line. And I think that was implied or understood by the project team as we move forward, but it was definitely emphasized. In terms of board structure, again, in New Brunswick, they felt the directors should vote independently. They felt the directors had the opportunity to vote independently and make the decisions as they felt were appropriate moving forward. When we arrived in Nova Scotia, we were once again met with a regulator who had some very strong points that they wished to emphasize. As you can see in the quote, they made it really, really certain that we understood how important getting this done right was there. And also in Nova Scotia, they had actually prepared written notes, which Russ Kinghorn was with us, and they formally submitted those notes to the President of Engineers Canada, who acknowledged their receipt as kind of a parallel process. So here was an opportunity where having all the right people in the room also allowed an opportunity for Engineers Nova Scotia to express some concerns which may have been at least partly outside the scope of the project, but we're able to table those directly with the President. When we discussed the principles, they were not all that comfortable with the principles, and they were actually quite skeptical that Engineers Canada would be able to implement the principles, and they highly recommended that we do a significant redraft, which of course we're going to do. We're going to take all this information and work with the governance committee to see how these things can be redrafted so that they are more in alignment with the regulators' intentions. In Nova Scotia, they also felt that diversity should be included in the guiding principles and not just as a purpose for Engineers Canada. We received, again, a broad and diverse set of notes that are very helpful in terms of looking at the purposes of Engineers Canada. But in Nova Scotia, they also felt that maybe a definitive list, which was the approach that we did take, we said over and over again, is what appears on the final list of the purposes of Engineers Canada is what will be used to construct the strategic plan. Therefore, if it's on the list of purposes, it gets done, and if it's not on the list of purposes, it doesn't get done. Nova Scotia felt that that was too restrictive, and they felt that a definitive list was not required, and that the CEO of Engineers Canada should be free to interpret whatever actions were required in context based on whatever the situation was at hand in order for how the CEO felt the regulators should be supported. In when we discussed the purpose of Engineers Canada, once again, we saw or heard that a key function of the board is to provide strategic direction and therefore to produce a strategic plan, but also that strategic plan must be linked to the development of annual operating plans. And as you will see as the project continues, that is absolutely the case. There was also some comments on how we should rephrase specific other aspects of the purposes of the board, which we have on note. In terms of board structure, Engineers Nova Scotia concurred that the current format for the President's Group is not as productive as it could be, and other options should be explored. And their view of CEAB and CEQB is that they should report directly to the CEO and not to the board. In Prince Edward Island, we got a great turnout for Prince Edward Island, which was super helpful. Some of the folks there had spent a lot of time reviewing the material and had produced some pretty substantial comments as a result. In terms of guiding principles, number one, they felt that substantiated really means that the rationale supporting the background for decisions are shared with the regulators. So it's not just informing the regulators of what a decision is, but how it was arrived at and why, in particular, a decision was made would be an improvement in transparency within the governance process. And we heard expressed a similar theme, but it was expressed in PEI, that the national agenda means the collective requirements of all of the regulators. And this kind of defines that relatively clearly. When we looked at the purposes of Engineers Canada, PEI felt that the accreditation should actually extend to graduate programs. When we talked about whether or not Engineers Canada should be doing programs that resulted in benefit to individual engineers, and we had a couple of examples that we discussed just as examples, not as specific programs, but PEI felt that it was not the role of Engineers Canada to develop those programs. But they did feel that, once again, Engineers Canada had the need to facilitate and foster relationships between the regulators. So again, you've probably heard that 3 or 4 times by now. In PEI, they pointed out, in terms of when we discussed profiles, performance measurement, accountability, etc., they felt strongly that volunteers are difficult at the very least, or maybe even can't be held accountable, and how the thinking continues to evolve on performance measurement of individuals and it needs to take into account realities associated with what it means when we're working with volunteers. In terms of board structure, again, the concept of the President's Group, the discussion revolved around more information, more transparency. In this case, the availability of better minutes to the presidents that conveys what actually had been happening to the board. So they're definitely looking for more information for the presidents. It was mentioned that when we said the deans would not be an advisor to the board, but there would be a need to make sure that we had the right relationship with the deans, and that would need to be defined. It was really emphasized how important it was to have that right relationship with the deans, drawing into attention that not too long ago, it was the deans who were very helpful in bringing to the attention some issues associated with accreditation that needed to be discussed. And slightly different, but you're going to hear the recurring theme again, is the previous issues with the CEAB and the CEQB reporting to the EC board. Engineers PEI felt that those were still not addressed. And so, again, a theme that we heard multiple times, and you've heard me mention several times already. Then we got to go to Newfoundland, and once again, this content is a version that is still with the regulator in Newfoundland, and so it has not yet been approved by them. So in Newfoundland, regarding guiding principles, they had some wisdom around consensus is elusive and not always achievable, and maybe we should keep that in mind as we're thinking about how do we what kind of culture do we create for Engineers Canada as a whole, and so suggested to us that striving for consensus might be more realistic than insisting on consensus. Regarding the purpose of Engineers Canada, Paganel offered the advice that using the term engineering profession can be a little sticky. It's not well defined, and perhaps language that does not make use of that would be better. Again, we were told that the need to reflect in the public interest or in the safeguarding the public and all of that kind of terminology was important and should be reflected in their opinion. Under discussion on affinity programs with purpose number 8. Paganel did not see any conflict in the case with providing value directly to individual practitioners. So the concept of providing affinity programs to individual practitioners was fine with them. They did have concerns around the accountability of the CEAB and the CEQB and felt that progress needs to be made on how those organizations are in fact held accountable. And I think that over the last few months as we move forward on this, there has been some very useful discussions about that, and that discussion is probably going to continue for a little while. Paganel mentioned in terms of the purpose of the Board of Engineers Canada, they kind of extended that list beyond just strategic direction and included things like risk management, performance measurement, and legal requirements, as well as the need to kind of look at the GP policies overall to make sure that all of the responsibilities of the Board of Engineers Canada that had been previously documented are captured in terms of any shift in the governance model that we do as we move forward. In terms of board structure, Paganel concurred that it is the responsibility to put forward the views of their regulator, which is how we had stated it in the consultation slide, and they felt that that was very important, that every director should understand the view of the regulator and should be able to defend and present that point of view. And then we had a different kind of discussion after that, and then how does that affect decision making overall, but this was their key point on that. Again, the comment that the presidents need greater visibility into what is happening, therefore some type of forum is necessary for them to exchange views. And we definitely have enough multiple references to that through all the consultations to understand that a piece of work needs to be done in order to move forward with that. Because, again, the current format for the President's Group meeting may not be the format that is best serving the presidents or the governance of Engineers Canada as a whole. Now, doing a sweep across the north, we went to NAPEG, and we had a great animated discussion with a good group up there. And in terms of guiding principles, under principle number 2, which related to engagement of the engineering regulators, again, we heard that expressed in this case, in this particular area, that there was a need for a forum for conversation and discussion between the regulators. So as you can see, some ideas kind of occurred at different moments or within different structures of the consultation, but nonetheless, there were a lot of common themes that did emerge. For the purpose of Engineers Canada, it was stated that there's value being able to say that there is a national body that has a statement or a position on all things, for example, like climate change. They felt there was greater need for transparency with the Affinity Programs. And again, if Engineers Canada is doing research or tracking results, that it has to be part of the process that research gets back to the regulators themselves. On the purpose of the board, highlighted the need for fiduciary responsibility overall. And then in general, the other board structure options were supported. Finally, in the Yukon, we got a lot of support for some of the things we put forth and a lot of really good data on how to make things important. Under promotion for purpose number 2, they expressed the need to promote to the profession itself. Again, diversity needs to be defined, and is it the only term or the right term, and what does it really mean? In terms of accreditation, it was expressed, is there some need to look at evaluation of foreign trained programs in addition to Canadian programs? And then there was, again, discussion about affinity programs and in fact, there were multiple opinions in the Yukon on whether or not affinity programs should be offered by Engineers Canada. And there was really good points made on both sides, and we have those on record. Regarding the purpose of the Board of Engineers Canada, it needs to be made clear that the regulators must approve the strategic plan and the operating budgets, and the directors must understand their responsibilities and accountability. So again, a current theme. Once again, under board structure, presidents require some type of forum to exchange views. And we heard this in a variety of ways, and maybe you didn't see it in the slides as much as it perhaps should have been there, but just about everybody kind of said, there's really a role for the regulators that hasn't been fully clarified, and the regulators are really an integral part of the governance process itself, and that needs to be more clearly defined, and their role given the precedence that is needed in order to be successful going forward with that. And that is the summation of all of of these key points of view that we've heard during these consultations. It's a bit of a whirlwind tour, but with that, I'm going to give it back to Stephanie to talk about the board size options.
Thanks again, Christina. So before I launch into showing all of you the results, I find it's always helpful for us to sit back for a second and think about why are we talking about board size. You saw the slide at the beginning. We're talking about board size because in May of this year, at the annual meeting of members, a motion was passed requiring the board to develop a plan to significantly reduce the board size by 2020. And that plan has to be submitted by May of 2018. So the clock is ticking for us. We have 5 months, 6 months maybe, to prepare that plan and submit it. And so what we did was, after that motion was passed, there was a great deal of work on generating some options. And the options that were generated were shown to all of you in our consultations. There were 4 options put in front of everyone. Here they are. So this should look familiar to anyone who was part of a consultation. It's important to know that these options are presented to everyone in order to help the board develop a plan, and that plan goes to the members. So the members are the regulators, and it will be up to them, as represented by their president, to decide what to do with the plan that is submitted by the board. But because we had this opportunity of doing these consultations, we thought it was important to know what every regulator would like, and that helps us develop a plan that has some chance of being passed by the members at the meeting of members. So in the next slide, you can see the summary of the preferred options as they were expressed during the consultation.
Okay, I just want to make one correction. We do seem to have an error. So under BC, the preferred option is one with no weighted voting.
Okay, thanks, Christina. So what you can see here is the preferred options that were expressed by the regulators as we recorded them, despite some mistakes potentially as we went around. And where it was expressed, a clear second choice is also listed here. There were some regulators who felt that we should maintain the status quo until we had a better understanding of either what the problem was or what the potential solutions were. And so you do see 2 regulators who didn't select one of those 4 options. What we do see instead is that every regulator had a preferred option, some had a second choice. And what needs to happen with this information now is that the board will need to develop a plan to put in front of the members. What the members do with that plan is up to the members. They want the plan to be able to be implemented by 2020, but whether they decide to accept that plan, when they decide to have that plan implemented by, is completely at the discretion of the members. And just to be 100% clear about that, the members of the 12 regulators, they're represented by their presidents. So when the presidents get together at the annual meeting of members in May, they will have in front of them a plan that is developed first by the governance committee, validated by the entire board, and put in front of them for their consideration. There was, throughout the country, in most places, I guess, not everywhere, but in most places, there was a strong feeling that the board needed to be smaller, and everywhere there was agreement that the board needed to stop growing. The current way of calculating board size allows for the board to grow as long as the size of the membership grows in each regulator, and everyone recognized that that's not a sustainable model. And most people wanted the board to get smaller. So the next steps on this are defined in terms of who is going to do what, but what the results will be in the long term is not known at this point. What's important to note about the board size and what's in bold on this slide is that all of the other issues that we consulted on during this round will be able to go ahead without any changes to board size, or regardless to what happens with board size. Whether we have a board of 12 people at the end of this or a board of 27 people at the end of this, governance improvements and the foundational documents that were reviewed all throughout the fall will be able to be changed and improved, and those will result in improvements for Engineers Canada. So the next steps for us, in addition to making these considerations with the board size and developing that plan in regards to board size, is to update all of these foundational documents. The governance committee will be the group that takes a first crack at that and provides recommendations to the full board for the board's consideration in February. Every change that we are proposing will need to be implemented in a different way. Some things can be approved just by the board because they're policies that the board has control of. Some things will need to be approved at an annual meeting of members or by the members because they relate to a change either to the bylaws or to the articles of continuance. But each one of these will be addressed separately, and we will make sure that we have it well established and clearly defined what steps need to be followed in order for every one of these changes and improvements to take place. I want to really emphasize that we are not going to try and put together one big package of all the changes and pass it in one big motion at a board meeting. We will look at each one of these things on its own merits and make individual decisions about what is best for Engineers Canada. In addition, we're going to put forward these recommendations for board size, for the foundational governance documents, and we're also going to make sure that the consultation process itself is revised and improved to incorporate those lessons learned that we talked about at the beginning and that were mentioned as Christina went through some of the slides individually. So that provides us with a summary of what we heard this fall. Clearly, there is still a lot of work to be done, and this work isn't finished. You will continue to hear about this for a number of months, and this also will lead us into additional improvements in regards to the strategic plan and the other changes that are necessary at Engineers Canada. I am really grateful that every one of you participated in this, and I'm committed to making sure that we take all the input that you gave us and use it to create a better Engineers Canada that is more responsive and serves the regulators in the way that you need it to and that we want it to. I'm going to turn things over to Christina to finish us off. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I hope you all have great holidays.
So that concludes the presentation today. I just want to emphasize one more time that the table slide, and I'm going to double check the content slide for Engineers and Geoscientists BC, should reflect that their option choice was option 1 with no weighted voting. So we will make those changes, and we will be sending out a revised copy of the presentation right after this. So once again, please accept my thanks as well for joining us here today, and the thanks of the entire team for all of the hard work that went into the consultations. You gave us your best thoughts and gave us a lot of your time, and we will certainly be doing our best to represent the points of view that you shared with us as we go forward. So with that, we'll conclude, and thank you so much for today.